So we're focusing right now on the just transition. And of course, the increasing pace with which the Arctic ice is melting really does put the focus on the need to cut emissions dramatically and accelerate rapidly towards those net zero targets. But the question is, how do you do that by ensuring that it really is a just transition for all the workers and communities, and particularly those communities where all of the infrastructure is dependent on fossil fuels? So how can Scotland and the Arctic really pursue this swift decarbonisation, but at the same time promote energy security and ensure that jobs are not lost and communities feel involved? Well, this is what we're going to be talking about in this next session, and I'm delighted to say we have a great panel of speakers to discuss all of these problems and challenges and opportunities ahead. So please welcome, first of all, Daria Shapovalova, who is the co-director of the Aberdeen Centre for Energy Law. Welcome, Daria. Great to have you here. Also, Hannah Mary Goodlad, Head of Baltic Sea Area Development from Equinor. Welcome, Hannah Mary. Also, Jake Malloy, RMT Regional Organiser for Offshore Energy. Welcome, Jake. And Anne-Marie Koninsk, Senior Associate Fellow for the Egmont Institute and formerly the EU's first Ambassador at Large for the Arctic. So great to have you all with me today. Daria, can I start with you? I mean, you've looked extensively about this issue and the just transition and just whether or not it's progressing in the way that everybody would hope. What are your findings overall? Where would you say has progress been made, but where is the biggest problem?
I think the biggest progress is that we started talking about it, that we started defining what we understand as just transition. This is not the luxury we had, 10, 20, 30 years ago. This is not something we considered when we phased out coal. So I think a recognition that this is an important issue and needs to be addressed is the great first step. It's great that we define the principles of just transition. In Scotland, these are included in the climate change legislation. I think now the challenge is really developing some measurable indicators and goals. And our research team believes that these should be place-based indicators and goals for practical just transition that is informed by evidence and is informed by communities and is done together with communities and with the workforce.
So that's what we want to happen. But where would you say that we're on that road and we're progressing well towards it? Or would you say that we've already hit some obstacles?
We are at the beginning of the road. The obstacles will always be there. I don't think we are ever going to be able to, tick the box of just transition. Even if you look at the principles, they sometimes might seem a bit unachievable. So it's a really destination and not the end goal.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Hannah Mary, would you say Scotland is being ambitious enough at this stage?
Scotland has always been ambitious. I think that this is a nation where we have huge innovation. We're filled with inventors, and that's part of our DNA, right? We've always been pushing the boundaries. But when it comes to the energy transition, we have one of the most ambitious targets in the world, net zero by 2040. So it is pushing the boundaries. But when it comes to the energy transition, we as industry, we as a society, we've been through many transitions before. We've been through the bio age, to the coal age, to the current age that we're in with oil and gas. And now we're on the cusp of this sort of industrial revolution in terms of electricity, the electricity revolution. But what's interesting is when you look at those transitions is that in every single transition, we've actually just added energy. We've not replaced it. We've not actually done a transition. For example, we use more coal now than we did in the coal age. So we've added on. So my challenge there is, are we actually gearing ourselves up for a transition? Or are we just adding on renewables to a very sort of unstable cake at the moment? So that's where we need to really double down and focus, is actually pivoting away from oil and gas and being able to replace oil and gas as opposed to just adding on electricity on top.
And how do we get there? What else do you need? What do you need from government? What do you need on the international stage, perhaps, to make sure that Scotland is allowed and enabled to really fulfil its potential? Because it's had a bit of a head start. I mean, we've talked about being blessed with natural, in the natural lottery twice. But how do you make sure that you don't just, spend all your winnings quickly and forgo the chance of having a just transition?
So I would say that we're actually blessed 3 times round. I think our fishing industry is first class to none. So I think we've probably won on many, many lotteries, actually. But I would like to focus on education, because there's a lot we can say about policy, and there's a lot we can say about technology to get to net zero. But what I'm really keen, and what Equinor is really keen on seeing, is that the energy transition doesn't become this middle-class academic project. And I don't say those words lightly. What I mean by that is that we need to have education at all levels within the system so that Scottish people can gear up to really understand what this energy transition is about. And when you understand something, you can contribute. And when you contribute, you can make change. So as good as it is to have a degree or higher education, actually a lot more needs to be done in terms of our apprenticeship schemes, our college schemes, our courses that are enabling people, especially in remote areas across Scotland, like Shetland, where I come from, to actually be able to contribute in terms of being able to work in this industry from the bottom up. So a just transition, for me, is really about focusing on many things, but education has to be forefront of that.
Thank you. So, Jake, let me bring you in. Would you share Hannah Mary's views on education? Do you think education and retraining really needs to be an added focus? And then do you think if that happened, that you may be able to bring more workers and younger people into the renewable industry and see it as a viable career rather than feeling as though they're taking a risk?
I don't think it's a case of if, we must, because we don't have the skills. Sadly, we're in a situation just now because of skill shortages that we're seeing the whole employment market heat up, especially in the energy sector. And you don't want that. We've been there, we've done that. We can't go back and repeat the mistakes of the past. So we've got to invest in the schools, the colleges, and our young people, and give them a roadmap, give them something credible about the future. Because right now, sadly, what they're seeing doesn't instill that confidence that there is a future. That firstly, they're not properly engaged. I mean, we've been hearing so much this morning about engagement. There's no real engagement going on right now in terms of the future. They've got to be informed, as Hannah's saying. They've got to get excited about it, and they should be getting excited about it because this is it. This is the big one. As Hannah said, we've done transition after transition after transition. I'm old enough to have gone through the mining one, and then the oil and gas one, and now we're doing this one. But this one is the end game. This is the finite one. This is the one that will see the rest of them go. So we've got to invest in our young people and get them involved in this industry. Critical. But it's critical for the industry as well, because if we don't, it's going to pass us by, as it is right now. Instead of thousands upon thousands of exploited workers out there right now, we should have workers out there, right? We should have apprentices out there on every vessel, every operation right now.
And when you talk about engagement, what kind of engagement do you really want to see? Obviously, making sure that the skills are there from school age right through college and university and apprenticeships and that kind of thing. But in terms of the wider societal engagement, how do you think that could be achieved?
Well, we're trying. I mean, it might sound crazy, but we're sitting down with Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, Platform, all of these climate change groups. Well, not them all. We'll leave it at those three just now. But what we felt was needed was we needed to bridge that gap. This almost pro-oil and gas, anti-oil and gas. We're never going to do a transition if we're throwing rocks at one another, and it'll pass us by. We've got to get involved in the engagement. We've got to get involved in debate and try and work together, because there's more that unites us. There's more that we agree on than we disagree on. It's finding compromise in between to get us through that transition piece. And that's, to me, is where events like this, we've got to get out in society. You know, I was sitting down in the village hall down at Fitty just a few months ago watching a film with the locals in Fitty. And they're saying, how do we get involved? And I said, well, get on to Mr. Lockhead and give him a hard time. Tell him what we want. Tell him that you need this, you need that, you want training, you want yours. This is what it's about. It's the only way we're going to make it happen is political will. And that was why I was a wee bit frustrated this morning, I've got to say. No offence, Mr. Lockhead, but you know, this idea that Scotland is going to do it, we're not. We've got to depoliticise this as well. This is for the country as a whole at this minute in time. Put the ideology to one side, whether you support it or not. This is about making sure we get this transition right and everybody gets taken along with it. And you've got to take the politics out of it.
Well, I'm going to make sure that Richard Lockhead gets a right to reply a little bit later on when we have a chat. You know, that is crucial. Anne-Marie, you know, you've been the EU Arctic ambassador at large. You know, you're now really involved in foreign policy. This kind of inclusion, though, keeps coming up again and again, whereby people just feel estranged often from the decisions that are taken at a higher level. How do you get over that?
Yeah, in the first place, I would like to say that for the European Union, energy transition is absolutely key. You mentioned that Scotland has very, very high targets regarding environment and climate change, and exactly the same for the European Union. So the only response to that is green energy and energy transition, and particularly, I would say, in the Arctic. But it's not very easy to get there. There are obstacles to it, challenges to it, and one of the challenges is exactly to get an engagement of the people. Now, if we're speaking on European level about just energy transition, we see, I would say, mainly two issues. You have the engagement of the local people and the youth, and particularly it has been mentioned before by the Norwegian secretary that all the difficulties that, for example, you have for the moment in Norway, where it's called to have green colonialism, where the people feel that they are not really engaged with what it's happening, decisions taken without them. I think there the EU policy, in any case, is very clear. The EU Arctic policy is you need an engagement, you need consultation, and there have to be, from the beginning a decision, people must be involved. The problem is with our policy is that although it's a policy like the Scottish policy, which is based on respect of human rights, the implementation is not by the European Union, it's by the individual states. So it will be by Norway, Denmark, Finland to engage it. That's one problem. The other one is the just transition, which has been mentioned for workers. And there we have, I think, it's not directly linked with the Arctic policy, but it applies to the Arctic policy. The European Union has a just transition instrument. I think also Scotland has a just transition mechanism. And this existed originally when in the European Union the mines were getting too close. And now it has been applied within the Green Deal policy of the European Union, a fair transition for everybody. And it's part of the European cohesion policy, which means that we would like to have a kind of equality cohesion between the different regions in Europe, and particularly focus now on these regions where there is a very difficult energy transition. It focuses on giving funding, on entrepreneurship, on young people, on reskilling, on restructuring the industries, and it's a lot people focused. For example, there are help desk, exchange of good practices which are happening, and it's a fund of 19.2 billion euros. So it's big money, but it's also, I would say, focused very, very much on the people.
Okay, so that's good to know that it is the focus, but I suppose it just depends on how it's implemented in practice. And Daria, what has your research thrown up about engagement and the best way of doing it? The funding may be there, but how should it be deployed?
I'm not sure the funding is there for engagement. I think one of the principles within the Climate Change Act in Scotland is that we need to develop and maintain social consensus by engagement with communities, with workers, with unions, with industry representatives, and any other groups that might be relevant. But it is very difficult conversations to have, and I think our research group has actually come together out of frustration of not having inclusive conversations. We have seen during COP26 that NGOs were meeting separately, industry leaders were meeting separately, so we have actually held a Just Transition workshop at the University of Aberdeen last March. Jake was there, and I was very worried because we had people from Shell, Friends of the Earth Scotland, we had Platform, we had North Sea Transition Authority, we had an MSP, we had academics, so we had a really mixed bag, and it was a lot of work to convince people to come. I had to calm down the industry that, you know, we are doing our best to make sure that no one's going to throw oil at them, and then go to NGOs and convince them to break their rules on not sharing a platform with the industry. But these are the conversations that need to be had, because it's much more difficult to be angry and ideological when you are meeting people and you see that people are actually not bad. You know, there's this nice person from Equinor who's actually you're gonna have a good conversation with. I would be very difficult to be mean to Hannah Mary in person. So, and through these conversations, we did have some challenging discussions, but this is where I think universities and more neutral spaces can really come in and be very active and offer that support. But from the regulatory perspective, the current laws do not support just transition, neither in the transition away from oil and gas, nor in the democratization of the renewables. We have the same issues here as we have in the Arctic. We all heard about the protests in a Norwegian parliament a couple of weeks ago over the fact that even though we have a Norwegian Supreme Court decision that fossil wind violated human rights, there's nothing that has been done about it. And we have similar challenges here. So in Scotland, if the project is big enough, the decision-making rests with the Scottish government rather than with the local authority. People find it processes of public participation, and it's a quote from a Just North project, obscure and exclusionary. And I ask my students in energy law and engineering many times, how many of you have participated in consultation on marine spatial planning or strategic environmental assessment or environmental impact assessment in your area? And I'm lucky if there is one or two. And if those students, if those people who are educated in this area do not participate, what hope is there? Who finds in their leisure time to go through a 400-page document, develop expertise, and then draft a response knowing that most likely it's not going to be taken
fair,
into
Louise
account?
from Marine Scotland did make a call out for people to fill in the consultation, but clearly, perhaps the way that those call outs are, and perhaps the way that the consultation papers are devised, that needs to be looked at again. Is that what you would say, that they need to be more accessible?
Absolutely, and I'm all for speeding up the process for transition, but when you're giving limited time for people to participate, the industry is doing it as a paid job. They're the experts. People are doing it in their free time. So we have to take that into account, and we shouldn't rush limiting deadlines at the expense of excluding people from decision-making if we're serious about just transition.
So how at Equinor, Hannah Mary, do you approach this? I mean, I know that certainly work quite in depth with different communities where you might be pursuing projects, but this kind of engagement on a wider scale as well, when you're not going into communities, but you're talking to a nation at large or much wider regions, how do you approach this?
I mean, I think Daddy is spot on. This is about people at the heart of this. And whether you sit in a company like mine or you sit outside with a protest banner, people are passionate. I entered this industry to change things, and I'm as passionate, and I'm not alone in Equinor. There's as passionate people as I am within Equinor trying to be closer to the problem so that we can be closer to the solution. And I think that at the heart of this, it's about dialogue and facilitating dialogue around the table, because when you have heartfelt passion there, that's where solutions can be found, and that's where common ground can be found. Equinor engages, to come to your question, Equinor engages across multiple countries, right? But we have a policy of doing things from the bottom up, because we believe in meaningful consultation. We don't believe, and we haven't got things right in the past, always. Nobody has. We always have one eye on the future and how we're going to be measured in the future, and really how we do things is more important than what we do. But we have to engage on the bottom-up level. So when we were building Highwind Scotland, just off the coast here in Peterhead, I had just sort of made my entry into renewables, and I was a couple of years into the industry. I come from a fishing background, and so I was sent in there to do the negotiations with the fishermen straight off. And we invested a lot of time in those individual dialogues with SFF and with the other organisations below across Scotland. And what I mean by meaningful consultation is that if we can understand that within a 60 turbine array, that if we can change a couple of turbines to allow scallop fishing to continue or allow sort of pelagic fishing to continue within a site, and we can make a few adjustments to solve that coexistence issue, that's something that we're open to, and that's only something that you can really put into practice if you have those discussions early enough so that stakeholders feel that they can have a meaningful amount of change process into this big consultation scheme that sometimes happens too late. And of course we engage at national level as well, but we have this policy of doing things from bottom up.
Okay, Marianne, let me bring you back in. We heard from Daria a little earlier. She said that the funding might be there, but it doesn't appear to be there for engagement. You've got any examples where actually, in your job, you have found where engagement has really worked?
Yeah. Maybe in general, my experience, I have been the last 10 years EU ambassador, including EU ambassador in Canada and an Arctic ambassador. And I felt an evolution in the discussion of the Arctic fires is the focus on people. People are becoming much more in the heart of Arctic and other policies. Their voice are being heard and becoming much more aware that you have to listen and to work with the people. Meaningful consultation from the beginning. In the Arctic and also elsewhere, mining of critical minerals is becoming absolutely crucial. And here the European Union has worked out an EU action plan for critical minerals. And it's an action plan which is on the one hand aiming to get sustainable extraction of minerals, which is absolutely key also for climate change, but it has a very big social part of it where it's focused on people, on the consultation from the beginning, involving the people, and that seems to work very, very well because the problem also in the Arctic and involving the people is with mining projects, which I have seen in Norway and in Sweden, but it's also applied to the rest of the European Union where mining is taking place, getting the people involved from the beginning in the decision making.
Mm-hmm. I just want to go back to you as well, Hannah, because it's the point that Jake was making a bit earlier about the opportunities that might be available in the green sector for people who are currently working in the fossil fuel sector within a company. What kind of cross-training is there? Or are there kind of silos within which stop that happening? And do you think sometimes the culture within companies that span both fossil fuels and renewables needs to change?
It's a good question, and maybe you can look really close to home as an example. So I've been a decade in Equinor. I'm a geologist by background. I worked here in the oil and gas sector in Aberdeen. I put the Mariner field into production. I'm really proud of that background that I have in terms of the oil and gas legacy that has been built up here in Aberdeen. It provides good jobs for this city. This city is really dependent on oil and gas, and it has one eye to the future, but it of course has one eye on the past. 5 years ago, I sort of held close to my principles, and I said to myself and to others around me, I really want to be part of this shift. And so in a company like Equinor, there's a lot of opportunities in-house to be able to shift across. So I looked at my skill set as a geologist, and I found some sort of transferable skills within the consenting environmental part of it. And I took a bit of a test and a pundit, and I thought, right, I'll just make the shift and try this. And it wasn't easy at the start. It definitely wasn't easy at the start, but it's best career decision I've ever made. And what we are doing in companies like Equinor is being able to facilitate that transition for folk from oil and gas across, being able to do really systematic transferable skills across, but not just skills of people. You know, we're talking about technology as well. The technology of oil and gas is powering the technology of many, many low carbon and renewable future technologies. I could go into a lot of specifics about that, but it is technology in transition and people in transition. Where I think we need to do more, and where I think the Scottish Government needs to do more, and I'm looking at my friend there, is really have a plan for the tens of thousands of folk that are in companies that are perhaps smaller than Equinor, very oil and gas focused here in Scotland, and that don't have a foresight to sort of the renewable projects that are coming through. We need to have a plan for these good workers. We need to have a plan that takes their sort of needs and their ambitions into account. And I don't see that at the moment. I feel that the people part of the just transition in Scotland is not as ambitious as it could be.
Jake, what would you like to see among the employers that you deal with? Are you seeing some, good progress, but where are you hitting a brick wall? Is it with the smaller employers, as Hannah Mary is pointing out?
No, the small employers are actually working well with their employees, trying to sustain employment. But the supply chain simply isn't getting the work in the renewable sector right now, because, as we spoke about this morning, it's getting done in the United Arab Emirates, you know what I mean, where trade unions are outlawed and you get the prison. They're not exactly great on human rights. That in itself should dictate that we invest in our supply chain. But if I was answering that question of what I really want, I think I'd probably want a Scottish Equinor, because they are apart. I mean, I was sitting here nodding. I'm thinking to myself, I'm nodding, agreeing with an oil company. That's strange, but it's no strange, because there's a difference between that particular oil company and others. When we made a complaint about the way that Equinor were treating workers in the renewable sector in the UK, they came knocking at the door of our office and came in for a conversation. And then they met with us and workers and spoke about it. That doesn't happen with big corporations generally, and it hasn't happened for a long years. To their credit, we had 15 of them in a meeting last week for an hour and a half, but that's the first time that I can remember in 35 years that we've got them in a room to talk about the state of the industry and the sector. There needs to be a great...
And was that linked to the UK budget?
No, well, it was linked to lots of things, primarily the threat of industrial action and shutting their operations down. But they want to communicate to us about their concerns about the windfall tax, about the situation they're in, the situation the industry's in, the decline in the industry, the cost they face, the decommissioning costs, etc., etc., etc. Trying to persuade workers to accept that they can't afford to give them a pay rise, but that's a debate for another day. But we've got to work together to do the transition, because oil and gas is going to be here for a wee while yet. So we've got to work with them and do the transition piece and get a lot of these highly skilled, highly motivated people across into the renewable.
Because I suppose the danger is as well that if oil and gas has fallen out of favour, of course, because we know it has to, but that doesn't do very much for staff morale, for your own individual morale, if you feel that you're working in a sector that's like the ogre. So how do you still maintain that staff morale when you've got this trend happening, and when you, as you say, it's going to be here for a while? I don't know whether anybody else wants to talk about that.
I can certainly talk about that. I'm really glad to hear that Equinor came banging at your door, and it's kind of testament to what I'm saying. What we do is second to how we do things, and one of the reasons that Equinor behaves in the way that it does is that when we're overseas, we're representing Norway, we're representing the Norwegian state, and so that we're a state-owned energy company, and that gives us a certain behaviour. Now, Scotland could do that. Scotland could create an energy company that is state-owned, and it could have 3 pillars. It could be doubling down on renewables. It could be having the carbon capture and storage for many parts of the world's global CO2 waste. Scotland could become the storage place of that, because we know our reservoirs in the North Sea really well, and they're depleted. And then thirdly, it could be managing the decline of our oil and gas fields. But on to your point about ogres and the oil and gas industry, the oil and gas industry is a very valuable industry still, and in any net zero scenario that you see, oil and gas will still be used, and we need competent people that are proud to work in that industry. And yes, we transition people from oil and gas to renewables in Equinor, but we transition people back from renewables from a low-cost margin business that have gained commercial skills back into oil and gas. This is about broad energy, and broad energy is not just one technology alone. It's about a transition that has to encompass many, many technologies along the way.
Okay, Marianne.
I agree that transition implies many aspects, and a focus of, for example, the EU Transition Fund, where you have supporting the green transition, is to reskill the people. And as mentioned here, you have a lot of skilled people working in these sectors. It's a question of reskilling. It's maybe easier said than done. But I was struck when we had Arctic Frontiers, the discussion in Tromsø. There was a lady from the Green Deal from Sweden who was saying that for the realizing the green transition in the green, she said, to fuel the green revolution in Sweden, they will need 1,000 to 300,000 people for realizing that. So at the one hand, I would say you have people already present, have to be reskilled, and at the same time is a huge opportunity also for young, talented people also to have these jobs. So it's not a question of losing jobs, it's also a question of new job opportunities.
Daria, I know you wanted to come in as well.
I wanted to talk about the perception of sort of demonizing the oil and gas industry. So as part of our work, we've done a rapid evidence review report about how the oil and gas industry has shaped Aberdeen, and we looked at what kind of processes for just transition exists in the city and in the Aberdeenshire as well. And we looked at what kind of benefits have come out over decades to the region in terms of socio-economic benefits, but also what kind of challenges the local authorities and communities faced. And we have categorized one of those benefits groups as the pride in being the center for excellence. We have seen a lot of evidence from interviews and publications, people being pioneers in the North Sea, having done something that was not deemed possible, going out in those treacherous waters and bringing the resource back to the country, bringing the country out of the really big economic crisis at the time. But we also see that today many workers are feeling that pressure, that they feel like they're being demonized by this transition as well. It doesn't have to be this way. There is this shift, and we really want to see Aberdeenshire, the Northeast, being the center for excellence now for transition. But for that, we really need to put the workers in the heart of it. We need to work with communities, and I will go to what Hannah Mary said about, there is a plan lacking. And far be it from me to defend the government, but it's difficult to make a plan in the circumstances because we have Climate Change Act with the 2050 net zero target and we have the carbon budgets, but we don't have the same thing for oil and gas production. From all of the publications that we see, even with climate compatibility checkpoint, it seems like it's sort of business as usual and we're just going to let it come out and see how it goes. There is no plan, and I don't imagine it's particularly useful for the industry to not have the sort of mixed signals coming from the government. Yes, we're going to have more climate protections against oil and gas. No, we don't. So the fact that there is such a mismatch between what the Scottish government is trying to do in climate and just transition area and the fact that the UK continental shelf in terms of oil and gas is regulated wholly by Westminster is a great regulatory challenge and policy challenge, and how to take all of these fragmented pieces and marry them up.
I mean, there is this real concern that actually, because of what we're seeing geopolitically, that it's being used as an excuse to continue with oil and gas exploration and not transition fast enough. Obviously, the EU has taken a slightly different tack, haven't they? So can you explain?
Yeah, and I have a little bit difficulty to understand in the sense that everybody says transition is needed. oil and gas, absolutely. And I think that Aberdeen wants to get rid of a possible to be quoted as the capital of oil, of the European oil capital. And they want to get a more cleaner brand, I would say. But at the same time, you have here in Scotland and also northern Scotland enormous potential and already existing production, for example, of wind energy. You have one of the biggest wind off farms in northern of Aberdeen, which for us, European Union, beautiful examples of connectivity. The energy is connected from the north of Scotland to Norway. So I would say that you have this new opportunity. So why cannot this transition be used to also put people in these new renewable energy industries? So I don't hear anything here in the panel about that.
Hannah Mary.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So why isn't, given the potential and the head start that Scotland already has in, for example, wind power, why isn't this image of, say, Aberdeen, for example, changing more quickly, the perception, and what needs to be done? It's almost like you need a rebrand, and that could actually help incentivise and feel that workers have more opportunity going forward.
I think you need to look at so there's reality and then there's ambition. And I always veer on the ambition side, but I'm grounded by reality. And the reality of our energy today is that energy is electricity, it's heat, and it's transport. It's not just electricity, right? So energy as a whole is where we need to look at. And energy is 80% reliant on fossil fuels today in Scotland. That's our reality. Our electricity, the stuff that's powering the lights here, is 97% renewable in Scotland. But that's a small part of the energy total. What we do need to see, so that's our reality. We need to keep oil and gas. We can't turn it off overnight, but we need to increase the transition and increase the ambition that we have to do things a lot faster. What we need to see in Scotland is a pipeline of projects coming up, be far more ambitious on the supply chain demands from the Scottish Government towards these companies that are developing in Scotland. For example, in ScotWind, there is no sort of criteria that a certain percentage of the local content needs to be within Scotland. If you look at the States or you look at France, in their criteria for auctions, they are very specific on the percentage that needs to be within the French supply chain or the US supply chain. We should have the similar approach here if we're really going to have that pipeline of projects for workers in the supply chain, to have that foresight, to make that career transition, and to make Scottish companies have the confidence to be able to invest in Scotland. And then we'll tackle the problem of importing all these pieces and parts from the south of Europe and further afield in Asia. So I think we need to be far more ambitious on local content, actually, and far more ambitious with the pipeline of projects that we see coming up through. How can we fast-track ScotWind actually to this side of 2030? Because we're going to need it. If we're going to decarbonise, we need to electrify everything that we can. And we need a lot more renewable energy for that.
So, Jake, I can see you nodding.
Yeah, it's just that I keep hearing about the pace we need to get on with the wind farms, but there's a lot more to be done before we do the wind farms. You know, we can't get the electricity we're producing just now into the grid. So we've got to get the grid upgraded. We've got to get storage capacity done. We've got to get carbon capture done. We should be looking at decommissioning instead of throwing it on the beaches of Bangladesh. We should be recycling it, because all the stuff we're putting out in the North Sea now will need recycled. So there's a sustainability industry there as well. But none of that's been done because we've not got the plan. The plan is, we're devoid of a plan. All we hear is about plans and strategies and plans. I've been sitting listening to this for 7
You've got consultancy
years.
fatigue. We were talking about that in the previous...
Well, I mean, this all started for me in 2015. And here we are 8 years on and we're still talking about the plan. Come on, we've got to get our heads out our backsides and get on with this. It's passing us by.
What would be in your plan?
My plan would be that we do what Norway did in 1960-70, that we set it out, that we develop a plan for licensing, for development, for sustainability, for, cradle to grave, And we do that with the oil and gas right now. And we try and determine what we're going to need. And in between times, we do the grid stuff. And we haven't even retrofitted a house yet.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Not a single house in the UK has been done retrofitting. We haven't started that yet. And we could actually cut carbon emissions down, like you just said as well. Transport. I mean, if we tackle transport right now, the emissions would come hammering down. Just take all the diesel buses off, and let's get on with the hydrogen stuff, and let's get them onto hydrogen. Let's get the trains moving. There's lots more we could and should be doing, rather than just saying, let's get another wind farm, let's get another licensing round out for a load of wind farms. We don't need them right now.
Or maybe it needs to be done, and it all needs to be done, just everything accelerated, as the Norwegian report this morning highlights. Can I open the floor to questions? Yes, there's a question just in the middle, to the right, just getting the microphone. Thank you very much. It's like a big jigsaw at the moment with only a few pieces in it. Thank you.
Thank you for your panel. It was really important and really informative. I'll try to keep this as brief as possible, but my question has to do with how in this panel you've talked a lot about engaging Northern youth, like we're a homogenous, amorphous, apathetic blob of young people. But there are many of us who are passionate and want to get involved in circumpolar civil society, but we're being actively pushed away or being used in a tokenistic way.
When you say you're being pushed away, in what way would you say that?
Yeah, that was the second part of my question. So in events as recently as last weekend, when I participated in an Arctic Youth event in Glasgow, when I attempt to express my views on an issue or disagree with someone senior to me, it's met with hostility. I'm not an academic. I don't know as much as I think I do, or I should wait 15 years before I'm able to have an opinion on the issue. It didn't matter in these settings that I've lived a quarter of my life and in the North and all of my formative years in the Arctic, and I speak several Northern languages at a fluent level from living in these places. But because I am lacking a doctor title in front of my name, my experience is somehow subpar. So my question is, I'm 23, I live in the North, and I'm passionate about circumpolar issues with energy to spare. What can I do now? Or do I have to wait 10 years, get a doctorate, and then come back to be taken seriously?
Thank you. I'm going to put that question to Hannah Mary, because you're from Shetland. You've really ploughed your own path all the way through to the where you are now. Did you have a similar experience that you felt as though your voice wasn't heard? And if so, what do you do about it?
Yeah, and I hear your frustration. I can hear that in your question and your voice. I think that throughout life we get ignored. It still happens to me. And I think that you have to have that inner sort of resilience on your purpose and why you're doing what you do. Come and talk to me afterwards, by the way, and I'll listen to you, absolutely, and we'll have a good chat, okay? But I think you have to find your right circles, you have to find your sort of strength group that you're going to talk through, and you have to make yourself credible as well. You have to do your homework. It can't just be a voice from the side. You have to speak with intent. You have to go to these meetings prepared, or these, be prepared to have the tough questions brought to you. I think that's what I found important throughout my life. And I think there is something also about being a young woman as well. I speak from experience in this, and I see you're nodding as well, and I'm sure there are other women in the room nodding as well. We still have to play the game a bit differently, and I wish in 2023 I wasn't sitting here and saying that, but we do. And I seriously hope that when I'm, 53, I won't be saying the same thing. But in those situations, find yourself a group that are also equally as passionate as you. Be strategic about who you make friends with and who you make connections with. Use them to bring you up, and do your homework. Make sure that your voice is the right one that's being heard. And keep at it. Some people are going to ignore you, and some people will listen. And the ones that listen are the ones you should focus on. But talk to me afterwards.
And it's always great to surprise them later on in your career. So, Daria, what's your take on this?
I so sympathize, because you have said things that I was saying, 10, 15 years ago, especially as women. This is a very rather gender balanced room here, but these are not usually the rooms that I go to. No. The amount of times I was asked to, oh, Daria, will you take care of coffee? Will you do this? In the meetings that I came to lead is preposterous. Not that there is anything wrong with making the coffee, but I think I echo what Hannah Mary is saying, in that find, your network, find your space. And I'm not going to tell you that it's going to, get easier. You just learn to deal with it better. And I hope that, in 5-10 years, when that time comes, that you don't have to deal with those things anymore. I think from the perspective of youth and not gender, that's definitely an issue that we face. We often complain that there's not a lot of engagement and youth engagement, even on campus. I work at the university, and we have a few very, very engaged students, but the students as a large population are often stereotyped as, oh, they only will care about the exams and about, the grades. But we also see that students complain that when they do have some initiative, the lecturers will not support them. So in that, I will say support lecturers on strike, which is happening today, and I really shouldn't be here. I should be striking with my union and with my university. Sometimes that lack of engagement is not from the lack of want, but from just the lack of capacity on part of educators and people who you think should be engaging more with you.
Jake, I can see your...
Well, I think there's more than that. We talked about regulation earlier on, over-regulate and regulate. I think there's enabling regulation. I've been travelling back and forth to Norway for 30 years, and it still frustrates me and annoys me. And the Norwegian population offshore is getting on towards 40%. We've been at it here in the UK for 10 years longer, 40 or 50 years, and we're still at less than 5%. If there was enabling regulation which ensured that oil companies could accommodate females in the industry, as there is in Norway, the Work Environment Act, then we would have that diversity, and we wouldn't be in the skill shortage we're in now. We could actually exploit's not the right word, but we could bring more women and diverse into the industry across the sector if we had enabling regulation to do it. But we don't. We don't, and that's really frustrating for me, because
when you say enabling legislation, so obviously, we've got equal pay legislation. What specific legislation would you like to see?
Well, the Work Environment Act in Norway, for example, gives set rotas, so everybody works the same rota, everybody works exactly the same. The accommodation standards are such that it's one man in, one woman in, one man out. It's made to ensure that you can diversify across the male and female workers. Not in the UK. I spent the first 5 years in 4-man cabins, and then the next 10 years in 2-man cabins, sometimes 3, a lot of the time hot bedding. They just will not accommodate females in the accommodation. They don't even have female toilets in some platforms, you know what I mean? We're in 2023, for goodness sake, come on. Enabling regulation, the Work Environment Act in Norway, a similar act here would change a lot of things.
Let me get your take on this, Marianne.
I was not sure that I understood the question very well, but I would say, based also on my experience the last years, is that the voice of the youth is getting much stronger, and that's, I think, extremely important, not only at the conferences, but you hear it also, for example, also with the indigenous people. If you look, for example, at representatives of the Sami, they are mostly women also, and the youth have a very strong and convincing voice. So I would say, go for it. Don't let yourself disappointed, and we still are not at a level where there are equal rights and equal opportunities for women, but we have to continue to fight for it. And don't be afraid, go for it. And there are a lot, I think, also for, if you speak about young women, good of role models. But there needs also to be maybe more support peer support among women, which
Yes.
you had for a long time among men, which maybe is not always sufficient. But I believe in the youth. I believe in the women and the young people of today. They are really the future.
Can I
Thank you.
just say,
Yes.
on the youth part, I get it, right? Because climate change is a lot more personal for us. We're going to have to live with it for a very long time. And so that makes things a lot more urgent. So I understand that. But if I could give one piece of advice that I guess is sort of recycled and it's worked for me, the energy industry has been the place that I've been able to make the most change. And so I would encourage young people sitting in the audience today that perhaps are climate activists or environmentalists, consider it. Consider the outside possibility that the energy industry could be a place that you can make real change and feel very passionate about contributing back to society.
What would you say has been your greatest achievement since you took on your role at Equinor?
I can't narrow it down to one, because there's been lots of many good projects that I've been involved with. But I think that my current role, I head up the Baltic Sea development of offshore wind. I really enjoy that, because I see small sort of independent states in the Baltic states that are really trying to be ambitious, very much like Scotland, be ambitious with their renewable plans. And I know that the work that I do and my colleagues are doing to help government shape that, it makes a difference. And yeah, I can't narrow it down, but I think that the people I work with are really inspiring, and the projects that we work with are really interesting, and I know that we're making a difference to the world. And for me, it doesn't get much better than that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you. Do you know what? I'm going to round off this panel now, because I think that's been a fascinating discussion, and there are lots of points I think that have been brought up that I'd really like to put to Richard Lockhead and make sure that we've got enough time to address them all. So I really appreciate your time. It's fantastic. Thank you.